Looking back, the moment my oldest brother, Ethan, discovered that our middle brother, Jake, had sabotaged his engagement cake with salt instead of sugar, that's when our family entered a war zone. Ethan took one bite, paused dramatically, eyes watering from the salty betrayal, and instantly knew who'd done it. And when Ethan retaliated by uploading Jake's embarrassing karaoke video onto Facebook, making it public, of course, well, things went nuclear. But what none of us expected was that their petty feud would force us all to confront years of pent-up frustrations, turning laughter and insults into something surprisingly meaningful. But let me rewind. It all started a week earlier, when Ethan proudly announced his engagement to Ashley at Sunday dinner. Jake, never missing a chance to poke fun at his older brother, immediately mocked Ethan's overly rehearsed proposal speech, sending the table into a fit of laughter. Ethan's pride was visibly bruised, and he shot Jake a glare promising vengeance. At the time, we laughed it off. Just brothers being brothers, right? How wrong we were. Jake wasn't done though. Ethan, the family's golden boy, was organizing a formal engagement dinner, meticulously planning every detail to impress Ashley's parents. The centerpiece? A massive, beautifully decorated homemade cake, which Ethan insisted on baking himself. Jake volunteered to help, an offer that should have immediately raised suspicion, but Ethan, blinded by his own excitement, agreed without question. On the night before the dinner, Jake casually entered the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, replacing the sugar canister with salt. His intentions were harmless enough, he'd later claim. Just a playful jab meant to tease Ethan's rigid perfectionism. Unfortunately, things rarely go as planned in our family. When Ethan cut the cake at the party, proudly handing a slice to Ashley's father, the tension in the room was palpable. Ethan beamed confidently as his future father-in-law took a cautious bite. Immediately, the older man's face twisted in disgust, desperately reaching for water. Ethan, mortified, tasted the cake himself, and realized instantly he'd been set up. In front of everyone, he shouted Jake's name like it was a declaration of war. And that was only the beginning. Looking back, the moment my oldest brother, Ethan, discovered that our middle brother, Jake, had sabotaged his engagement cake with salt instead of sugar, that's when our family entered a war zone. Ethan took one bite, paused dramatically, eyes watering from the salty betrayal, and instantly knew who'd done it. And when Ethan retaliated by uploading Jake's embarrassing karaoke video onto Facebook, making it public, of course, well, things went nuclear. But what none of us expected was that their petty feud would force us all to confront years of pent-up frustrations, turning laughter and insults into something surprisingly meaningful. But let me rewind. It all started a week earlier, when Ethan proudly announced his engagement to Ashley at Sunday dinner. Jake, never missing a chance to poke fun at his older brother, immediately mocked Ethan's overly rehearsed proposal speech, sending the table into a fit of laughter. Ethan's pride was visibly bruised, and he shot Jake a glare promising vengeance. At the time, we laughed it off. Just brothers being brothers, right? How wrong we were. Jake wasn't done though. Ethan, the family's golden boy, was organizing a formal engagement dinner, meticulously planning every detail to impress Ashley's parents. The centerpiece? A massive, beautifully decorated homemade cake, which Ethan insisted on baking himself. Jake volunteered to help, an offer that should have immediately raised suspicion, but Ethan, blinded by his own excitement, agreed without question. On the night before the dinner, Jake casually entered the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, replacing the sugar canister with salt. His intentions were harmless enough, he'd later claim. Just a playful jab meant to tease Ethan's rigid perfectionism. Unfortunately, things rarely go as planned in our family. When Ethan cut the cake at the party, proudly handing a slice to Ashley's father, the tension in the room was palpable. Ethan beamed confidently as his future father-in-law took a cautious bite. Immediately, the older man's face twisted in disgust, desperately reaching for water. Ethan, mortified, tasted the cake himself, and realized instantly he'd been set up. In front of everyone, he shouted Jake's name like it was a declaration of war. And that was only the beginning. Ethan wasted no time plotting his revenge. He knew Jake's weaknesses well, and humiliation was always his weapon of choice. Jake was carefree, yes, but notoriously sensitive about his image, especially around friends and co-workers. And Ethan held the ultimate trump card, A long-forgotten video from our cousin's wedding where Jake, visibly tipsy and passionately off-key, performed a cringe-inducing rendition of "I Will Always Love You," voice cracking on every high note. Late that night, as Jake smugly recounted the cake sabotage to our youngest cousins, his phone suddenly erupted with notifications. Friends, co-workers, and even ex-girlfriends flooded his inbox, teasing, mocking, and sharing screenshots of the newly uploaded karaoke disaster. Ethan's caption read simply, "Dedicated to my dear brother Jake, the Salt King." Within hours, the video had become a viral sensation within our small suburban community. Jake's reputation was now the punchline of every group chat. Jake's reaction was swift and explosive. He stormed into Ethan's room, fists clenched, voice trembling with embarrassment and anger. Ethan, lounging casually, didn't even flinch. He calmly reminded Jake that actions have consequences, like salty cakes and ruined engagement dinners, and offered to remove the video only if Jake publicly apologized. Of course, knowing Jake, that was never going to happen. In retaliation, Jake doubled down, escalating their sibling rivalry into a full-blown family conflict. His next move was deviously personal. Ethan was known for meticulously detailing his prized car every Sunday morning. To strike back, Jake filled Ethan's windshield washer reservoir with neon green food coloring, knowing Ethan would compulsively spray his windshield the next morning on his way to work. And when Monday arrived, Ethan unwittingly painted his luxury sedan's windshield, and nearby pedestrians, with fluorescent streaks of lime green humiliation. Ethan, now infamous as the green window guy in the neighborhood, was livid beyond words. He marched home that evening, ready to unleash a fury we'd never seen before. But their antics, hilarious as they seemed from the outside, started digging deeper into the hidden tensions beneath their relationship. Our family was laughing nervously, caught between amusement and genuine worry, sensing that beneath their childish revenge games lay years of unspoken grudges and unresolved hurt. And soon enough, everything exploded, not in laughter, but in a confrontation that none of us would ever forget. Ethan barged into the living room that evening, slamming the door behind him with enough force to make everyone freeze mid-conversation. Jake, sensing confrontation, immediately stood up, arms crossed defiantly, ready to match whatever his brother threw his way. What had begun as a playful battle of pranks had finally reached a tipping point, and the tension in the room grew thick enough to silence even our normally chatty grandmother. Ethan started slowly, voice tight and controlled, recounting every humiliation he'd suffered at Jake's hands over the past weeks, from salted cakes to neon green disasters. But as he continued, his anger quickly turned raw, unfiltered, dredging up memories from their childhood that had been buried for years. Jake's irresponsible pranks, Ethan's unfair perfectionism, and the constant competition that had quietly torn at the fabric of their brotherhood. Jake responded sharply, firing back accusations of his own, reminding Ethan of all the times he'd been labeled irresponsible, lazy, or unreliable, always made to feel inferior next to Ethan's polished perfection. The room was silent, painfully tense, as years of hidden jealousy and resentment spilled into the open. Even our father, usually quick with a joke to break tension, stood helplessly quiet, sensing this wasn't something humor could easily mend. Their argument escalated until Ethan shouted something none of us expected. "You've never cared about anyone but yourself. You ruined my engagement dinner because you couldn't stand the spotlight on anyone else. You sabotage everything because you're afraid you'll never measure up." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His defiant posture softened instantly into hurt silence. Ethan himself seemed shocked at what he'd said, his anger momentarily replaced by an uncomfortable realization of how deeply he'd cut. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of Ethan's accusation hung heavily in the air, transforming their petty war into something heartbreakingly real. Jake, struggling to regain composure, quietly muttered an apology. Something rare, something genuine. But Ethan wasn't ready to hear it. He stormed out of the house, leaving Jake standing in stunned silence, while the rest of us watched helplessly, unsure how to bridge the gap now separating the brothers we'd always believed inseparable. It was in that awkward, painful silence that I realized our family's greatest struggle wasn't the pranks or petty betrayals. It was that none of us had ever learned to truly communicate the deeper things that hurt us. And now, watching Jake stare silently at the door Ethan had slammed behind him, I wondered if we ever could. Days passed, turning into an uncomfortable week of awkward silences and careful avoidance. Ethan had withdrawn completely, avoiding Jake, skipping family dinners, even keeping conversations with our parents short and vague. Jake, meanwhile, became unusually quiet, retreating into himself, wearing a quiet shame that none of us had ever seen on him before. Just as our family started accepting this painful new normal, something unexpected happened. It was a quiet afternoon when the doorbell rang. Ethan wasn't home, but standing on our porch, nervously clutching a small, familiar box, was Ashley, Ethan's fiancée. Her eyes met Jake's cautiously, a timid yet hopeful smile breaking the tension. She gently told Jake that she understood his intentions hadn't been malicious, that Ethan's stubbornness had also played a part. She admitted that Ethan's obsessiveness over perfection sometimes made him blind to the feelings of those around him, especially those closest to him. Her words offered Jake an unexpected lifeline, a sign that perhaps his brother's anger had begun to soften, or at least that forgiveness was possible. Encouraged, Jake shared something with Ashley none of us had ever heard before. Beneath his playful exterior, he had always admired Ethan's certainty, discipline, and determination. Jake had never intended harm, only wanting, in his own flawed way, to remind Ethan not to take life too seriously. Ashley listened thoughtfully, sensing the sincerity beneath his usual joking demeanor. And then, in a move that surprised us all, Jake and Ashley formed a gentle conspiracy of reconciliation. She suggested they work together, creating an event to draw Ethan back into the fold, a family gathering he simply couldn't refuse. After some thought, Jake nodded, finally smiling for the first time in days, genuinely determined to mend the damage he had done. Together, they planned a surprise family barbecue, casual, intimate, and exactly the kind of gathering Ethan always secretly loved, despite his outward insistence on formality. Ashley would persuade Ethan to come under the pretense of discussing wedding details, while Jake would quietly organize everything behind the scenes, making sure each detail subtly reflected his brother's favorite things. His favorite foods, music, and the warmth of a family gathering that Ethan would find impossible to resist. Watching Jake carefully preparing Ethan's favorite burgers, meticulously arranging the patio furniture, and nervously checking every detail, I realized something had shifted. Jake wasn't simply trying to apologize. He was learning, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to take responsibility for someone else's feelings. And when Ethan finally arrived that evening, cautiously stepping into our backyard, eyes widening with surprise at the familiar warmth waiting for him, I saw his stubborn resistance falter. Jake stood quietly near the grill, a hesitant smile of apology on his face, silently hoping his brother would finally accept the olive branch he'd so earnestly extended. For a tense moment, Ethan hesitated, but slowly, a smile broke across his face too, gentle and forgiving. The ice had finally begun to melt, and maybe, just maybe, our family was ready to heal. The barbecue unfolded into a soft, laughter-filled evening, gently washing away the lingering tension that had gripped our family for weeks. Ethan and Jake didn't immediately rush to reconcile. Instead, they quietly circled one another, exchanging cautious glances and hesitant smiles. But as the night stretched on, the natural rhythm of family warmth inevitably drew them closer together. Eventually, as twilight settled around us, Ethan moved toward Jake, holding 2 cold drinks in his hand, quietly offering one to his brother. It was a small gesture, but between them, it spoke volumes. Jake hesitated briefly, then accepted with a sheepish grin, meeting Ethan's eyes cautiously. Standing side by side near the softly glowing fire pit, they began to talk. Not about cakes, pranks, or videos, but about the simpler things they'd both missed sharing with each other during their feud. I watched from across the patio as their voices grew lighter, their laughter more genuine, both finally allowing themselves to step past pride and resentment. Ethan admitted, quietly but clearly, that perhaps he'd taken himself too seriously, letting the pursuit of perfection overshadow the bond they'd always shared. Jake, in turn, admitted he'd hidden behind humor to avoid expressing how he truly felt, always afraid of falling short of Ethan's impossible standards. And there, beneath strings of softly glowing lights and the gentle hum of family conversation, they finally forgave each other. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in quiet words and shared jokes, gently rebuilding the bridge their feud had burned. Soon, they were laughing openly, retelling the now infamous cake story from their new, reconciled perspective, drawing all of us into their warmth and easing the worries we'd carried for far too long. By the end of the evening, Ethan and Jake seemed transformed, lighter, kinder, and more understanding toward each other than we'd ever witnessed. They stood together, reminiscing about childhood escapades, and for a moment, I saw them exactly as they had always been meant to be. Brothers, friends, allies against the world, each respecting the other's differences rather than resenting them. Weeks later, at Ethan and Ashley's wedding, Jake proudly stood as Ethan's best man, delivering a speech that brought equal parts laughter and heartfelt reflection. He joked openly about their salty misunderstandings, their viral karaoke embarrassments, and the green windshield fiasco. But his voice softened when he spoke of the bond they'd rediscovered, reminding all of us that even the strongest relationships sometimes fracture, only to heal stronger than ever before. As Jake concluded his speech, Ethan hugged him warmly, their embrace sealing a silent promise that no petty rivalry, no misunderstanding, would ever come between them again. And in that moment, I finally understood the depth hidden beneath the humor and chaos. Family isn't about perfection, about never stumbling or hurting one another. It's about forgiving, laughing together, and accepting each other's flaws. Looking back now, years after the great cake betrayal, I realize how much our family changed because of their feud. Not through anger, but through reconciliation. Ethan learned humility, Jake discovered responsibility, and together, they reminded all of us that even the deepest wounds can heal with patience, laughter, and love. In our family, salty cakes and embarrassing videos have become treasured memories, reminders that, in the end, our imperfections bind us more strongly than our successes ever could. That's it for today's story. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more wild Reddit stories. Until next time, stay curious and keep the stories coming.